think it's really important for those of us who are new to the area to understand like what has gone into these structures over the last 100 years when folks were just getting to the valley. Large portions of these ditches were dug by hand.
Or horses.
Or labor. It's just I think the farmer's ditch diversion itself, the first diversion structure was boulders that were cabled together like pearls on a necklace. They drilled holes through the boulders and put a cable through and put it across the river so the boulders wouldn't roll away.
Wow.
So it's been, and folks have been doing these repairs to these diversions, on a shoestring budget. And something that I learned recently while putting together a large grant for the Farmer's Ditch program is that, just because you have maybe the oldest water right on the river, that doesn't equate to gobs of money in the bank. So that's not how that works.
Well, thanks, Jake, for coming today. Really appreciate you coming down here, and I'm excited to dive more into this topic of water management in the North Fork Valley. I moved here just about 2 years ago, and this has been I see this as an opportunity to orient myself a little bit and understand water management as one of the critical issues of this area. I know we have some unique challenges and opportunities being at the headwaters of the North Fork here. So I want to get into that and want to get into the assessment that you sent me from the Western Slope Conservation Center. Was that 2017?
I believe we finished it up. Yeah. 2017.
Yeah. So that feels like it's still very relevant today and has a lot of good points for us to go over. And why don't we start by just getting into your background a little bit?
Sure. Let's see where to start. I got into watershed restoration work right out of college in the Midwest. I grew up in Illinois, and right out of school began doing wetland restoration work, mostly for water quality and sediment control and that sort of thing. And then through a number of different detours of life, I was in construction for a time and then back into water work and moved to the North Fork Valley about 7 years ago. So not too long ago. But one of the things I first learned about in moving here was how important water is. And coming from a place like Illinois where you get 37 inches of rain a year, folks aren't thinking about irrigation there for the most part. There's some sandy soils that are definitely irrigated in the Midwest. But in Illinois, it's a great climate, lots of topsoils, prairie soils there. So moving here to the North Fork Valley, where we get 8 inches of water and then snowpack, and learning about where agricultural water comes from, that's kind of where I dove in. And I started to volunteer with the Western Slope Conservation Center shortly after moving here. That group is a group that's been in the area for 40 plus years. They were a merger of two groups. There was a group that was more focused on public lands advocacy and designations and working with kind of the larger public entities. And then there's another group doing river restoration and doing some work with agricultural users. Those two groups merged together and formed the Western Slope Conservation Center. So through a number of different avenues, I became the watershed program director at the Western Slope Conservation Center for the past 6 years and just recently left.
And what's their role in terms of water management? It seems like they're not authoritative in the way that they're telling people what to do, but they're providing information and getting stakeholders together to understand what the consequences of water management decisions are.
Yeah, that's a good point. They are a nonprofit conservation organization that is very interested in the resiliency of the community and maintaining the way of life that we have here. And they understand how important water is, and water management's a piece of that. And a lot of the water projects as of late in the last 10 years or more has been about where do you find these multiple benefits? Where can you benefit the health of the river as well as meeting agricultural needs? So they're a good role to play to kind of reach a lot of a larger audience.
And maybe brainstorm solutions that are win-win for the different parties.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when this report was produced in 2017, you were a director at the Western
Watershed program director.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And those two assessments, we get into those in a little bit here. Basically, they came out of what the statewide initiative of the Colorado Water Plan, which was to come up with a way to meet the supply-demand gap that was happening and people were seeing looming in 50 years of more folks coming in, more water demand, but less water availability. They saw that coming. So the idea was to develop a number of these different integrated water management plans, or stream management plans they were called, to try to identify ways to make the most out of the available water that we were seeing currently and also in 50 years.
And is most of that use agricultural?
It is, yeah. Most of the water use, certainly on the western slope, is agricultural use.
Can you talk about, before we get into the report, and we're going to dive into some details in specific areas of the watershed, can you talk more generally about the types of issues that you're trying to balance when you look at water management?
Sure. There's a lot. I mean, it is, I think folks are pretty aware of like what's going on in the greater Colorado basin. And
overall, we've heard a lot of reports of water shortages and, people in other states. I just moved from Arizona and, it's been in the headlines a number of times. The status of Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Are those both tied to the Colorado basin, or?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Lake Powell is in Utah. Lake Mead is in Arizona. Two big reservoirs that not only supply water, but also hydroelectric power to much of the West. And those reservoirs have been in slow decline here in the last 30 to 50 years.
Yeah. So
certainly.
Even as we talk about what's going on here in the headwaters,
Right.
There's all of this is connected to what happens downstream.
Right. So the upper basin, the whole river basin is divided into, in half, so to speak, at Lee's Ferry, basically, is the dividing line. And so the upper basin, that includes Colorado here, and the headwaters have done a number of different efforts to try to figure out how to best manage water. And so the Colorado Water Plan was out of that. And stream management planning was a piece of that. So that's kind of where these came from.
So I'm imagining some of your concerns are managing the overall flow of it. We would get seasonal inconsistencies with the snowpack coming down. The reservoirs are there to balance that out somewhat. And then you also encounter what's the status of the riparian zone around the river. Does that have some ability to absorb the shock of high water flow?
Right. Yeah. And so you're talking about, a number of different things there, but healthy soils, healthy riparian areas around the river are great for, holding water longer and functioning to extend the season of water availability. These particular reports, we focused on infrastructure improvements, like diversion infrastructure. A lot of the agricultural diversions on the North Fork are really old, like 100 years old, and don't have the means to manage it in such a way for the, I guess, the needs that could be coming. And so, yeah, we can talk more about that as well. But there's, looking at all of these different integrated water management plans around the state all look very different from each other. Some of them are looking to identify minimum flows, like what's the minimum flow requirement that'll meet ag needs, environmental needs, recreation needs of the watershed themselves. And, in these reports, these are just the assessments. So we didn't take a look at what those minimum flows would be. We, after talking with a lot of agricultural users and other entities, the infrastructure itself on the North Fork is so old and antiquated that to even try to think about what minimum flows would be is kind of a non-starter. And that tied in with, that the river is over allocated and there's a lot of water demand. We took a look at where we divided the river up into reaches.
And of course that's sensitive because, for anybody who's in agriculture, that's their livelihood.
Correct.
Is their water supply.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes, there are inefficiencies in the system, certainly, but being able to make a difference in those inefficiencies is really tied to the infrastructure. And also it's definitely up to the water managers themselves to make those choices. So we didn't want to get into setting some sort of minimum flow.
Right.
That was based on no data there's
Right.
very little data.
Right.
So,
yeah. All right. So I'm going to read a little bit of the executive summary here just to kind of familiarize us with this and to get the viewers, the listeners on the same page with us. Mm-hmm. So here's a section from the executive summary. Based on the review of previous assessments and recent stakeholder interviews, this assessment has prioritized a number of short-term, mid-term, and long-term suggested projects on the North Fork of the Gunnison River. The highest priority projects include creation of a river stakeholder group to improve multi-use communication and assist in watershed management planning, improvement upon existing invasive species inventory and monitoring, invasive phreatophyte
is how that's pronounced.
That's a new word for me. And other invasive species removal, reinitiation of morphological river channel monitoring of established cross sections. Okay. Bank stabilization, riparian corridor development of additional public access points, improved boating and fishing infrastructure, and investigation of market mechanisms for mitigating current and future water use conflict. Okay, so we got everything ranging from recreational uses of the river to irrigation uses to ecological concerns and trying to have a healthy riparian zone, and maybe looking at some of the economics of it. So, yeah, did you have something?
I just think it's great to read those again. It's in 2023.
Right.
To just kind of the sense of what has happened, what has changed, and what, in my mind, I'm just thinking of different priorities and how they've kind of played out. So go on.
Yeah, and we can get into that as we go, like into some of these. This is all broken down by the, they're called reaches. There's 8 different reaches that the North Fork is broken into. And is that just in the context of this report, or are there many other places where that terminology is used?
There are a number of other stream management plans or integrated water management plans that have done the same. It creates a little easier tool set to identify priority stretches that might need some improvement.
There's different stakeholders that are mentioned in this report. I see local communities, agriculturalists, recreationalists, wildlife. Can you give an example of a conflict that's occurred between these different stakeholders and how it was resolved? So that's kind of more of a general question before we dive into stuff.
That's a great question. There hasn't been too many conflicts, to be honest. And having done this for a while, it's interesting to find that a lot of our conflicts are perceived conflicts. We expect there to be conflict. But when you talk to folks, there's very little conflict between, maybe opposing entities. I even hesitate to use that word, opposing. We did put together a stakeholder group, very loose assortment of folks. We had one meeting a number of years ago to get everybody in the room. And then since then, we weren't able to meet together during the pandemic, of course. But since then, we've kept kind of loose ties. We keep in touch with everybody. And basically, that first part of the recommendation there to create a group of stakeholders for the North Fork was so that, a lot of interests are represented and that people are just talking to each other. Believe it or not, in the North Fork, there's a very strong independent spirit.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, we do it ourselves, and we can probably do it ourselves just fine. But in a river system, there's just kind of exists a lack of communication between, not just between, the recreation folks and environmental folks and ag folks, but even in amongst those groups. They're all, ag folks are really busy doing farming, and so when they change a head gate or something happens, their first instinct is not to call the next ditch down to let them know. So,
right.
But we're on the same system. So that whole stakeholder idea is that folks would communicate and amongst themselves and make the system work better. But as far as conflicts, I have to say, there may be others out there who could say different, but I can't say there's any major conflicts.
We talked to some of the ditch riders, we might get a different
You
story.
might,
Yeah.
but that's their job.
Yeah.
So to mitigate conflict.
All right. So it sounds like for the most part, people acknowledge the needs of others in the water system. And once they know about that, they find ways to work together.
Yeah. And I'd encourage people who see that there might be someone on the other side of their fence to just talk to folks. Like just talk to people and see what their needs are. What are do they have concerns when related to water? And, it's very interesting when you actually get down to one-on-ones with people that there's very few conflicts. Few conflicts that can't be mitigated.
So this is on riparian function by reach. And I'm wondering if you could speak generally to the effect that human habitation and modification has had on the riparian zone of this valley and how that's affected the natural plant and animal species.
Yeah, I did a workshop a few weeks ago on kind of like the historical North Fork and what it may have looked like. And there's other folks too that I would recommend you guys interview if you start talking about kind of river health and folks that have been here much longer than I have that know a lot about the history of the North Fork. But the North Fork is a very dynamic river that it wants to braid, it wants to push out into the floodplain, which we're seeing right now. It has a wide sinuosity, I think, as it's, when it's especially certainly like this time of year, it wants to really spread out. We have a big wide valley. So I think, in my understanding as humans, as white humans have settled this area and really encroached upon the breadth of the river's expansion, has channelized it in a number of locations. It really happened in the 1980s, where folks would get in with bulldozers and straighten the river out. During the summer when the flows were down, just that was the common knowledge for flood control, for a number of things, was straighten the river out, get that river downstream as quickly as possible so it's not flooding. the area.
Okay, so when it goes through its curves, it's more likely it's going to slow down, it's going to spread out.
Right. So the linear distance of a river, the more curves and sinuosity is what that's called. The more distance there is, the slower the grade is, or the lower the grade is. And because rivers are really sediment transport systems, they're really moving, they're erosive. So they're moving sediment from the high country to the low country. If you shorten the distance of the river by straightening out the meanders, you actually increase the grade, which increases the speed, which increases the amount of sediment that's transported, which downcuts the river and creates basically more problems downstream.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was
you may
happening
have
a
solved
lot.
your immediate problems by saying, hey, river, just get on past this section.
Right.
But then you're carving a deeper and deeper channel, and the water's hitting that next section faster than it was before.
Right. And it not only leads to flooding downstream, but it also isolates the river from the natural floodplain. And as that downcutting happens, it actually lowers the water table across the floodplain. So you end up with trees, dying, wetland vegetation dying at the farther reaches of the river, and basically narrows that riparian zone to just the channel itself. And you actually end up irrigating more, and you end up with a loss of soil moisture in the upper layers. So that was happening a lot in the North Fork right around the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that report, we talked about those areas. You can still see that channelized sections, and there's on the other side, there's also many areas that have not been channelized, and there's still connected floodplain.
So we're going to talk about Reach 2, which is, I think, not directly abutting the reservoir, but is it one section down from that?
Yeah, I'm curious where Reach 2 started. We organize these reaches according to major diversions.
Uh-huh. This is the one that's talking about the Fire Mountain
Starting at Fire Mountain.
diversion.
Sure. Yep.
So we're talking here about boat passage. Many recreationalists use Reach 1 during the late irrigation season due to its continued natural flow. However, passage through Fire Mountain Canal diversion is extremely dangerous, if not impossible. And some of the other text I was reading said it's also very difficult to portage around there. Mm-hmm. So there's a recommendation to improve public access. There's currently no public access point for recreational users within this reach of the river, but the river runs along Highway 133. There's a number of accesses currently illegally utilized, and so funding for some legal access points is recommended.
Yeah,
has there been any progress or developments in that area?
I would say yes and no. It's what's not said there is that 95% of the entire river is privately owned. Mm-hmm. And so there are very few public access points to the river. And that includes either getting a boat in the river or fishing or from the bank. It's mostly privately owned. That section of the river is, I would say, not for the novice boater. So, since that report was written, thinking about safety in that section, Fire Mountain diversion is certainly unsafe for the novice boater. It is sometimes passable, but we haven't really pushed river access for that reason, because for safety.
Yeah.
And
it's already an unsafe section. So
it's an unsafe section. It's also a fairly private section, private use. So to portage around Fire Mountain diversion, you'd have to be on private property. Mm. And the next public access point on the river is in Paonia. So it's a long stretch to just, be in your boat.
Sure.
And there's a few other diversions below Fire Mountain that are also, very dangerous.
Gotcha.
So we've been cautious about trying to promote recreation for those reasons. It's often like if you build it and you promote it, we will certainly get more use, but also more trouble.
And one of
Potentially.
the comments I was reading about the Fire Mountain diversion as well is that the way that's built, it's piling up a bunch of sediment behind the diversion. Seemed like a potential problem both for the river and possibly for that irrigation channel as well.
Yeah, the orientation probably could be better as far as like where that diversion is placed. However, Fire Mountain has figured out a few things to keep debris and out of that head gate, which has been good. But as I recall, I think there has been some momentum to try to find funding to just improve that diversion in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I will add that Fire Mountain Canal is probably one of the more advanced ditches on the system. They have telemetry controls on their gate and various sensors that talk to each other along the ditch so they can manage water a little better. But the orientation is a little off. And some of not in that case, but in some cases, orientation of head gates has to do with where the river has moved as well. So it's interesting having a concrete structure to divert water on a river that's moving, that from side to side and creating new bank and taking out bank.
Yeah.
So a lot of adjustments.
Yeah. So let's talk about Reach 3. And there's a section in here that caught my attention. Upstream headwall, the island that separates the Stewart's Ditch diversion channel from the main stem of the North Fork has a tendency to collect considerably more than the decreed volume for the ditch late in the irrigation season. So, obviously that's going to be sensitive subject matter for anybody affected by that. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how that situation is being approached, hopefully gracefully.
Yeah,
to kind of take care of people's needs there.
I'm not sure how that was worded. It might be that there is an island there that separates, that it acts as like a diversion channel,
Mm-hmm.
and it often takes most of the river just the way it's set up. But what's coming into the head gate, I don't believe is more than their decree. If it is, there's a turnback shortly thereafter that puts the access back to the river. I'm not quite familiar with how that functions. We did another assessment associated with this one that was very focused on agricultural details such as that.
Mm-hmm.
And we had an engineering firm called JUB out of Grand Junction did that analysis and figured out, how much water is going in and going out. And so that report might speak more to it.
Gotcha.
I will say, though, that, since the time of that report, we have worked with Trout Unlimited, another organization here, that they have, I think they have obtained all the funding to improve that diversion. So they will be fixing how that diversion functions probably in the next couple years.
Oh, cool.
So, yeah, and these are big projects. So it's a big lift to try to get all that funding. But yeah, that section of river, basically below Fire Mountain, Stewart Ditch diversion and the Farmers Ditch diversion, we're both in progress of getting funding to improve those for multi-benefit project.
Yeah, and that other report that you mentioned, the JUB report, I think that'd be a great follow-up conversation for us at some point. I wanted to hit this one first and kind of get a overall context for the river watershed here. But yeah, irrigation seems like its own subject that we could dive into.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's 12 major diversions on the 33 miles of river here from Pioneer Reservoir down to the confluence with the Gunnison main stem. And they're, nearly all of them are really old diversion systems. There was a number that were improved in the 1990s and early 2000s through the North Fork River Improvement Association. But there are several diversions, including Stewart Ditch diversion, which is still a push-up dam, which is where you, in the late season, as the water recedes and you're not able to get the water into the head gate, you bring a bulldozer in and you push all the rock up in the river so you can get it. And that is, and then
So they do that every year.
Every year.
Yeah.
Yep. I think as vegetation kind of grows in, they don't have to do it as much, but sometimes every year. And it's an inefficient way to do water management. It's also not great for river health, as you can imagine.
Right. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about what we would do differently today? You mentioned that infrastructure's aging. We take different approaches today. What was it then besides these push-up dams? What other kinds of infrastructure do we have, and what would we do differently?
There are a number of different mechanisms to create a diversion in a river. I'll give you an example of what we're doing with Farmer's Ditch, which is in that Reach 3, I believe, 3 or 4. We are designing, I say we, but the engineers are designing a rock structure that will, go on top of the existing diversion dam that would create like a lower gradient fall behind it. And there would be an automated gate that does the job of diverting water late in the season. The automated gate is pneumatically operated so that when you don't need a gate, it lays flat against the river bed or the actual concrete structure that's there, so that fish species can move up and down the river, boats can get through during that season when there's water to boat. And then late in the season, of course, you can raise that gate and be able to get the water when they need it. So that's one example of an improved system.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we just didn't have that, and certainly didn't have the funding for something like that when these original things were built.
I think it's really important for those of us who are new to the area to understand like what has gone into these structures over the last 100 years when folks were just getting to the valley. Large portions of these ditches were dug by hand.
Or horses.
Or labor. It's just I think the Farmer's Ditch diversion itself, the first diversion structure was boulders that were cabled together like pearls on a necklace. They drilled holes through the boulders and put a cable through and put it across the river so the boulders wouldn't roll away.
Wow.
So it's been, and folks have been doing these repairs to these diversions, on a shoestring budget. And something that I learned recently while putting together a large grant for the Farmer's Ditch program is that, just because you have maybe the oldest water right on the river, that doesn't equate to gobs of money in the bank. So that's not how that works. So you're really trying to keep these things maintained. And it's only been in the last, 20 years or so that money has started to come to these these infrastructure projects. And recently the Biden administration they passed a bipartisan infrastructure law bill that provides billions of dollars to the Colorado River Basin to improve infrastructure. And it's still difficult to get. I go on about that, having just wrote a grant for it. But I think we're just now seeing how important the infrastructure is to the Colorado River Basin, and certainly the headwaters like our valley.
Yeah, and having funds to improve that certainly will affect people both in this area as well as downstream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
So Reach 4, improve the North Fork Farmers Division, provide modification to the diversion structure. The one that stood out for me here was resume the monitoring of the 1997 cross sections. So that was one of the core recognitions of this report is that basically the 1997 monitorings were never continued or followed up on. Can you talk a little bit about what was monitored there, and has there now been any follow up to that, and what would that look like?
Yeah, that's one of the most fun parts about putting this report together was looking back at all the assessments that have been done on this river over the years. And there's a lot of them. There's been a lot of assessments put together by various groups. But one of the early ones was in 1997 geomorphological study done by Crane and Associates, which is Jeff Crane. If you know Jeff, he's still around. He's actually helping with the farmer's ditch diversion. But Jeff kind of got here in the 90s, and you got to remember that back in the 80s they were straightening the river, and taking the meanders out. So he's a river morphologist and by profession, and so he took a look at the whole thing and said, "This isn't going to work. It's just going to get worse and worse if we continue to operate like this." So he did a study very early on of various cross sections in the river to basically create a profile of the river bottom and do a study of what the gradient of the river was from point to point and along its entire reach. And at that point, there were, I believe, 3 different in-stream gravel mines also going on. If you can imagine, there was straightening of the river, but there was also mining of the river, pulling material out and crushing it and making roads, and so that's just exacerbating the sediment transport issue. And so that was primarily what he wanted to do, is he wanted to create a baseline of what is the river doing right now. And that's what that report was about. And so when we revisited it, we said, "Oh, it's been long enough time. There's been a number of changes. No one's mining in the river anymore. That's been taken out, and gravel pits are outside on the floodplain. There's been a number of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like a stabilization in certain areas. And so the recommendation was to do that geomorphological study again, go to those cross sections and see how the river's changed."
Yeah, 20 years has passed at this point.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that has not been done yet.
When that report was run. Okay, yeah. So still no updates on that.
Still pending.
Is that waiting on anything? What's happening in that process?
I would say waiting on funding, I suppose. We've put our efforts towards improving diversion structures and for water management more than anything. But
when I look at the overall expenses of the suggested changes, most of the most expensive changes are essentially for improving the diversions, and those can range from $100,000 to $300,000. Whereas this collection of data on the overall course of the river was what, $10,000 to $20,000.
Yeah.
So it's actually a smaller portion compared to many of the projects that are suggested, and it seems like it would give you a high level map that would affect many other things.
Yeah, I agree.
Or would inform them.
I completely agree. I think it's definitely a worthwhile endeavor. It just hasn't been on the list, but it's probably an easy thing to fund, and those cross sections already exist. So it'd be a good study to pick up.
Is there anything you want to say about Reach 8, where we rejoin the main Fork of the Gunnison?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It is. We've got
incredible.
Pleasure Park right there.
Yeah, it's really incredible. This river is really unique from its headwaters that are mountain stream to then going through an agricultural floodplain through the main valley of the North Fork, and then as it gets down into that Reach 8 section, it kind of enters the canyon again. Enters like a desert canyon, and it's very, very interesting down there. So there's a chunk of it that is public land, Bureau of Land Management, down at the Gunnison Gorge National Conservation Area. It doesn't have any agricultural diversions on it at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all return flows from irrigating field, and then the return flows would come back into the river at that point.
Let's talk a little bit about piping. I know we're going to get away from the assessment a little bit and go back to more general subjects. But I know we've got a irrigation ditch that goes along the ridge here in Paonia, and that's one that's recently been piped. I know there's other efforts to pipe irrigation channels. I was wondering if you could just talk about some of the pros and cons of that and how it affects different people, as well as the the plants and animals that are nurtured by that open water and then no longer by the pipe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of goes back to that topic we were discussing about, irrigation ditches dug by hand for, when we first started irrigating the land. And now there has been a pretty big effort to pipe ditches in the North Fork Valley, also the Grand Valley around Grand Junction, mostly because of salt numbers. Our soils here that a number of those ditches flow through are Mancos Shale, which is old ocean seabed, which has a high concentration of salt. And hydrating salty soils always leaches salt out of those soils. So the North Fork Valley and the Grand Valley have been identified as really the main sources of salt for the entire Colorado River Basin. Which is kind of amazing to think about, that
Right.
there's the Mancos Shale and the amount of ditch networks out here are contributing that much salt. And it's not just the ditch network. It's also like when you hydrate, flood irrigate those soils too.
It also tells you the mixed geology that we have here, because you have these lush riparian zones right next to, half mile away, there's a salt plain.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah, it is really remarkable. So there's been a big effort to pipe ditches to reduce the salt coming out of this area. And that funding is coming from, Bureau of Reclamation primarily, but from the lower basin of the Colorado River, really, that are funding the piping of ditches. So it's interesting, and this is kind of a hot button topic, piping ditches, because in one sense, you're improving water quality and you are improving water efficiency also.
You get more of the flow downstream.
Right, because ditches are inherently leaky.
And evaporating.
And all of that. So, however, ditches have been around for 100 years or more, and there's been quite an ecosystem that has developed around them, from cottonwoods, willows, and really small river systems. And in the North Fork Valley, we have hundreds of miles of open ditch. There's probably more concentration of open ditches in this valley than maybe anywhere in the West. I don't think I'm over-exaggerating there. Someone else can check me, but there's a lot. And so there's also, high amount of riparian artificial river system, so to speak, that's been created as well. And then any little ditch that's leaking into a drainage or, goes down a little gravel spur or something, creates, more habitat. So I think there's been some pushback against piping for that reason, because you're going, when you pipe that ditch, you lose that water, and that waste, so to speak, is, all of those ecosystems are going to die over time. So there's an argument to be made that that's an artificial system that was human created and never intended to exist there from the beginning, which is true to some extent, but also there's significant habitat there. So there is a requirement that if a ditch does get piped, there's a 5% of the funding needs to go towards habitat replacement, so to speak. So, not so to speak, has to go to habitat replacement.
Well, I think it's also a question of, regardless of whether it's natural or not, was it actually a good thing? Was it a positive thing if we're reversing desertification, right? And I understand there's resource consumption involved in that as well, so it's not a black and white thing. But I think it is a question of management and what outcomes are we looking to create. Whether you're creating lush environments and habitats from natural means like beaver dams, or from letting the river splay out and flood out, or whether you're doing so from the side effects of irrigation channels. I think it's worth looking at, is that producing outcomes that we want, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think now, being in probably 4 or 5 years here of some significant piping projects that have gone on, those are the questions that are coming up. It's like, what do we stand to lose here? What are we forgetting, or what are the things we're not seeing? There's been kind of interest in cumulative impacts. Piping one ditch, you could definitely say, okay, this is going to impact this habitat along the ditch, but if you pipe the next one over, that's also going to eliminate that habitat. But what have you done by doing both of those at the same time? And I
like maybe you've lost a wilderness corridor, or
you've lost a corridor,
something.
like a wildlife corridor, or you've lost infiltration that's providing a well, a spring, or maybe you've lost transpirative cooling, and so I think those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking, is like, before we go and pipe every ditch, we need to look at that, because if we do pipe our hundreds of miles of ditch, we don't know if that will raise the temperature of the valley. Are we going to lose that cooling effect? Are we going to lose spring sources? It's we've dramatically changed the landscape so much in 100 years. We've basically taken the river and riparian corridor and spread it out.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to be really careful about how we change the landscape back, in a sense. And if we're going to do habitat replacement, we really need to do it well and thoughtfully. Because it's interesting. It's the water efficiency thing is it's important to be efficient with water, but you just have to understand the power of what humans can do to a landscape in both directions, changing it one way or another.
Can you talk about how this might affect a town like Paonia, where we actually have some of the ditches here in town, and they are walkways for people, whether that's oftentimes illegal, right? They keep those paths essentially for the ditch riders and for management. But it ends up being a beautiful place to walk.
Yeah, it has an impact on the community. It's unique.
Well,
Yeah.
and could there be an effort, just like this report talks about efforts to put in legal access points to the river? Could there be some thought put into, let's use the ditch corridor actually intentionally in this way?
Yeah, I am not a ditch company,
Right.
so I can't speak, but I do know quite a bit about the subject, and that those access roads are for the ditch rider who goes up and down the ditch daily and makes sure that water's flowing and not leaking out, and making sure the head gates are appropriately stationed at whatever levels they need to be, and all that water management stuff. There's a liability concern,
Yep.
certainly amongst the ditch companies. And that's why most of them are very much, no trespassing, don't be on this ditch. So there's that piece. However, it's difficult to manage the population. There's certainly a beautiful place to walk, So I think there needs to be a just an education component that's talked about with the community that says, I'm not sure how you approach that. But I think it's an education from the ditch company that says, this is allowed, this is not allowed, that sort of a thing.
Well, again, I think for liability purposes, they just say no trespassing. It's not allowed. So at that point, they're covered. And if somebody's like
right
there, they're not supposed to be.
right.
And to your point, it's there for the ditch rider. So you don't want a gaggle of children like showing up and thinking they have the right to be there and delay the ditch rider in doing his job.
Right.
And you also don't want the health liability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a tricky issue for sure.
To me, it's kind of characteristic of Delta County as well. There's a lot of things that we do that aren't necessarily legal, or they're quasi legal, or the rules are vague around that. People kind of get things done. Like another example here is the biking paths all around Mount Jumbo, which were all established by people just doing it.
Yeah.
Right. And now the BLM's talking about it and they're thinking, well, how do we balance wildlife issues and try and create a more formal approved version of these trails?
Right. And thankfully,
kind of what happens in Delta County.
It does. Yes, it certainly does in a rural county. And I'm also thankful to live in a community that will come out and speak to these things. Jumbo is a great example. There's a whole community that is engaging now with the Bureau of Land Management about where the trail is going to go. They have meetings. It's a very engaged community.
All right. Sinkhole.
The sinkhole.
I'm just curious what your perspective is on this, because when I look at this photo, I can see where the road has collapsed in it. And it looks very much to me like a water stream coming down the side of the hill essentially pulled the gravel out from under the road and caused this collapse. I'm not an expert in this, but it looks like that's potentially a drainage problem.
Yeah, I believe it was a culvert. There's a large culvert there.
Collapsed?
I believe and I don't know the details of this, but culverts rust out, or culverts, waterworks around them. But certainly, it's right at Bear Creek there, and with our phenomenal snowpack and our early warming. Well, it wasn't terribly early warming, but our warming in April, all that low elevation snow had been stacked up there, and we had a significant amount of water come down. I think it blew the culvert completely out. It's interesting. I think all of these headwater streams they were really roaring last month, and now they're starting to taper off. But it's been really amazing to see the hydrology this year. We haven't had this kind of low elevation snowpack in a long time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at this point, as far as I know, we might have a sinkhole for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll see. Do you want to talk about beavers and other natural solutions to watershed management?
Yeah.
We had a documentary screen here in town a couple of months ago, and that's been a hot topic, I think, here in town.
Yep. Yeah. So since leaving the Western Slope Conservation Center, I started my own business, Terra Firma Land Stewardship, that focuses on habitat restoration work, headwaters restoration, wetlands work. And part of it is beaver mitigation, beaver mimicry, a little bit of beaver relocation that I'm starting to dabble into. Beaver are the best hydrologic engineers ever. They pretty much shaped this landscape. And to folks who haven't read the book Eager by Ben Goldfarb, I highly recommend reading that book about beaver and their curious lives. But yeah, I think it's been interesting going to different watershed conferences over the years in the West, where, when I was going to early watershed conferences, we'd talk a lot about different rivers and how rivers function and at different gradients, and they have a certain type and they all behave a certain way. And you can restore a river according to their type and gradient and location and had kind of this idea of what rivers do, and you can put them, humans can recreate a river system. And then the conversation has changed to, well, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work. The river is usually going to do what it wants to do. And so there was kind of began to be approach of, all right, let's look at our river and its floodplain as really just entirely river. So the whole floodplain, because in geologic time, a river might be over here, but in 1,000 years, that river is going to be over here. And in geologic time, that's really nothing. So a river, just treat the whole floodplain as a river and let it do its thing. So that was kind of the topics and talks of watershed conferences for a while. And then a few years ago, folks started talking about the role of beaver and how that shaped landscape, and how beaver are responsible for a lot of the sinuosity when their dams blow out, or just the pathway of a river system. So especially in the headwaters, beaver are extremely important because they're slowing and spreading water. And so, for years, for 100 years, or since the mid 1800s, we've been removing beaver and turning them into hats or whatever else. And so we've lost a lot of our beaver populations in the headwaters. But the function, what beavers do is they spread that water and sink it in the headwaters, and functions basically as a second snowpack. So as right now, as our snow is melting off, a beaver complex meadow will hold that runoff and slow it. And that's what we all want, is like a slow runoff, a slow melt is ideal.
That's what the farmers want.
Exactly.
It gives them a longer irrigating season.
Right. And so that's what beavers are doing in the headwaters. So they're doing that work by hydrating the aquifers. And because beaver dams are not like dams we build, beaver dams are permeable. They're always flowing water, even through them. Late in the season, they're allowing the water to come down. Mm-hmm. So they extend the irrigation season. Mm-hmm. They extend our water availability. So that's been a kind of a big focus of my work, is to try to improve beaver habitat in the headwaters. Work with especially ranches or folks that have private land up in the headwaters, to try to boost those beaver populations.
Just to close out here, are there any trends that you'd recommend people follow in terms of understanding what's happening in the river system, in the watershed, and how it impacts them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Trends. Yeah, I think we've had the benefit of having a phenomenal snowpack this year and looking at a great water year, but that's probably not the norm. The future is much, much drier. So, yeah, I think I would encourage water managers to look at natural systems as much as possible, as far as making a difference in mitigating climate change. I think that the irrigation infrastructure improvements are definitely needed, super important. But I really think that we should be putting our funding, as much funding, into headwaters restoration, and to think about water and rivers as keeping the wildness to those systems. They are inherently wild. So that means messy and hard to predict. But that's kind of how this whole planet functions. So that's what I would encourage people looking forward when it comes to thinking about water, is to work with the natural systems and allow for some messiness, and do the best we can.
How does a municipal system like Paonia or any other town along the river, how does that interact with the river? And how do our water management policies within the town, like our water usage, how we water our lawns, flush our toilets, all of that stuff, how does that interact with the natural systems around us?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially for any communities in the West, and certainly headwaters communities like ours. I think last summer when the the crisis, really, they started talking about the Colorado River Basin water as crisis is, I think, the word that Bureau of Reclamation used, and maybe even our Colorado Water Commissioner used. And I think the talk was that we all need to be using 30% less water to make this system work. And that's a huge number. That's not just 30% of an agricultural water use. That's like down to each of us in our own homes using 30% less water. That's a huge number. And that's what's more in line with the water available in the Colorado River Basin. So I think when you think about municipal use, Paonia is a kind of interesting, unique place because the domestic water in our town comes from spring source entirely. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a complex of maybe 20 different springs on the side of Mount Lamborn and Land's End, and there's different water companies that operate those different. Well, town of Paonia operates the treatment center, but then it's distributed out to different water companies. On the north side of the river, there are a number of spring sources for domestic water, and those are entirely treated and operated by their own water companies. I think it's time for folks like the town of Paonia and other small communities to start really pushing for things like gray water use, or there are known ways to recycle water or make use of water in a better way, and we just haven't done it yet. There's been gray water legislation that's been passed by the state of Colorado, but it's up to the counties to adopt it. So, pushing for that sort of an adoption, and, looking at just encouraging folks in xeriscaping and, different water use measures. A lot of even in town, a lot of the lawns and gardens are irrigated through irrigation ditches still. But there is an education piece that could be done by towns to really push for xeriscaping and utilizing native plants that have grown up in this area, that take less water. Mm-hmm. I think that the town of Paonia is small and maybe doesn't make a huge dent in the overall system, but there are many towns like ours. Mm-hmm. So I think it's time that all of Colorado really start pushing for thinking about things like gray water and how we live as humans.
So right now our water is coming in from various springs, mm-hmm. and it's being treated. It's held in a big cistern up on the hill. Uh-huh. When it goes out through when we flush the toilet, where's the water going?
There's a treatment plant, mm-hmm. that it all goes there. It's treated, and then it gets released back into the river after it's treated. Okay. So we are still intimately connected with the river system. Mm-hmm.
The water that's coming to us would have gone into the river basin at some point, and it's still essentially going on that path.
Right, but there's consumption along the way, certainly. Mm-hmm. So what's coming in is not what's going out. Mm-hmm. But I think being wiser in our use is what we have to do now.
Thank you so much for coming down here and sharing your experience with these things. I hope this will be interesting to a lot of people, and again, kind of help people acclimate here to the valley and to what are the interesting issues that revolve around water management. Is there anything you want to leave people with?
No, I think it's great. Thanks for having me. It's a very unique place we live here. I mm-hmm. do want to stress that. I think mm-hmm. I've lived in the Midwest and I've lived in Montana, and it's one of the most unique places I've ever lived. And water is key to it. And the way water is managed and moved about here in this valley is really interesting. It's really unique. So And there's an opportunity, as with such an engaged and active community that we live in, there's an opportunity to do it really well. So I will say that there's a lot more to learn.
And you're freelance now. You're offering
freelance.
your services as
Right.
a water management expert. What's your company?
Terra Firma Land Stewardship.
Okay.
Yep. And I can leave my information, I suppose, at the end of this.
Awesome.
Maybe that's best.
Yeah.
But yeah, just getting started, and there's lots to do. So
Well, we'll have to follow up with you on that and
Yeah.
see how that's going.
yeah, great. All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jake.